Thank you, Donald. Really good, great, isn't it great to focus on Jesus in the song and God, because He is our audience of one, right? Okay. I know last week we brought the Sermon on the Mount to a close, and we did a recap of the sermon. And we talked, in summary, with some of Jesus' really hard teachings, but we opened it up by saying, maybe we ought to have a chat about this. And I said, I guess I'll end up doing most of the talking. But today, maybe it's the other way around. You get a chance for you to do quite a bit of the talking. That might be at tables today. That's why we've got the tables around this morning, is to have some conversations around some of these hard teachings, and we've taken one from each of the 3 chapters for us to discuss. You've got the table prompts, questions there on your tables, and there's probably some extras around. No one's at this table, so if everybody wants to try to get one, feel free to come and pick them up elsewhere. Next week, just give you a little bit of a highlight, Justin Bolden, who has spoken here many times before, will be back with us next week. And he'll be focusing on a passage in Luke 14, the cost of discipleship, what it really costs us to follow Jesus. There's some additional hard teachings there that Jesus brings, and it would be helpful to bring some clarity and understanding to what Jesus meant in some of that, what might otherwise be viewed as really hyperbole, some really hyperbolic language there of you've got to hate your mother and your brother and your father and mother more than me to be able to follow me. So we'll be talking about that next week. But this week, back to some focus on the Sermon on the Mount. As we said last week, these are individual responsibilities that Jesus is talking to us here. And those responsibilities need to be lived out individually, less so collectively, although we did talk about as a church body, when you live them out individually, then collectively as a church body, we'll all come to a natural conclusion as to what it looks like living it out in the body. But the real focus here today, and this is what I want us to be thinking about as you go through these table prompts. What would Jesus want me to do in response? Not just what does He want the church to do, or what does He want some other organizations or institutions to do, like the government, parachurch organizations, etc. What does Jesus want me to do? Because we believe that Jesus taught the apostles taught the church fathers, that these teachings of Jesus indeed can be lived out. We may not be able to live them out perfectly, but with God's help, we are to live these out. So when we choose to live them out, how are we going to live out the sermon regarding 3 questions that we want us to go through this morning? So if you look at the very first one, and we'll take somewhere, it looks like we have time to probably spend at least maybe 10 minutes or so on each question. I'll sort of be the time monitor here. It's about 10:40. So if we spend 10 or so minutes on each one, we should finish up around 11:15 or so. But here with this first question, this is the section on salt and light. Some have called this the cultural commission, our commission into the culture to be salt and light. Well, this is the passage that's coming out of Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16. Actually start in verse 13, but if we focus on this section in the conclusion, the light is set outside the traditional church gathering. He talks about a light in the world, a city set on the hill, a light set on the table in your house, which lights up the whole house, and you don't put anything over the top of it to dampen or to dim that light. So the first questions that we have here that I want you to spend some time contemplating, talking among yourselves, and then, Stimmy, if you'll help out, here at the end of each question, we give a chance for some of you to report back. So what are some of the things you talked about at your table as to responding to these questions? So here's the first question. First couple of questions here. So I'll read through them. So are we to proclaim the good news of Jesus in the public square for the common good of all people? Because again, this is a light that's not set inside a traditional church setting to the world, city, community, in your household. And if we're not to proclaim the good news of Jesus in the public square for the common good of all people, if not, why not? Or if so, are there some areas in which we should exclude in that proclamation? So those are your thoughts to be pondering. Take about another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and hear what you had to talk about. Okay. Thank you for these discussions. Like it was some pretty hearty discussions going. Anybody want to sort of summarize what you came up with at the table in terms of this first question or so? Are we to proclaim the good news of Jesus in the public square for the good for all people, the common good of all people? If not, why not? And if so, areas we ought to stay away from. Anybody? All right, Mike?
Two things that jumped out for us. Number one, you got to live an exemplary life. If we're going to be the light, we have to be different, look different, talk different, act different than the people that are around us, so the world will see, in fact, we are different. And what is going on with these people, And the second thing is, which we've preached since day one of this church, is the most effective way to be a light is through building relationships with people and having margin in our life to allow us to have time to invest in other people. It takes a lot of time to invest in other people to give us the liberty more to share the good news, those kind of things. When that's grounded in a solid relationship, it's much different than just an acquaintance or somebody you run into in the line at the grocery store, So, Anyway.
All right. Okay, so one, we have to do this through relationships. So good news of Jesus in the public square for the common good of all people. So the public square would include our families, right? It's a really good place to start.
I think the starting point of this whole thing is not just this relationship with others, but our relationship with Jesus. We have to begin there and then recognize that while I agree that ideally we would live exemplary lives, that we don't live exemplary lives, and that what we need to do is live lives of love and lives of being welcoming people and lives that demonstrate the characteristics of Jesus, even though we will never do that perfectly. And we're not always going to be successful at being the friend that we ought to be to somebody or those kinds of things.
Okay. Anyone come up with maybe a different definition of the public square?
So, Charlie, we got one from online, from Tawana, who says, I believe we are to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. I do not think it needs to be done in the public square as a grand act or show. I believe it should be done in our public living as a daily practice. So that's another gloss on that.
Okay.
So, what we kind of came up with was, okay. So what we kind of came up with was, like, we looked at the people of the Bible and how the message was delivered and received in different parts of the Bible and how it is today. Like, regardless of how you're received, it is our mission and it is our job to at least bring the message to the world. It's not new that we're persecuted for it, but that's okay. Jesus himself was persecuted for what he was saying, and then all who followed him were persecuted beyond that in the public square. And even if 1,000 people walk past you and have ugly things to say, as long as 2 or even 1 and say, oh, I didn't, the mission is accomplished. I wouldn't say any area is to be excluded. Go to the world and make disciples.
Yeah. Teach them what?
I'm sorry?
What did he say to teach them?
Teach
everything that I have commanded you.
That's right.
That's pretty broad. So doesn't leave a lot of room for excluding, does it?
I agree with particularly what the first table said about one of the most important things is living an exemplary life before others. Every once in a while, though, we discussed it might be wiser to remain silent in certain situations. And I gave an example of experience I had just this past week with meeting with a group of people that I used to work with, and they're mostly liberals. And they got to discussing whether or not they were going to be attending the No Kings protest. Well, I thought, well, this might be an opportunity, but since the Christians among us were few and the others were pretty opinionated, I figured that might not be wise. We could actually do more damage by stirring up controversy under the circumstances than waiting for an opportune time when we can speak with individuals one-on-one. It just did not seem productive to want to knowingly cause a controversy. So there may be times when the why not is maybe the way to go under the circumstances.
So some wisdom to be used there, I think, is certainly for us to use as well. Without really getting into this a whole lot, but just let me say this and see if you believe this is sort of in keeping with Jesus' teaching. Knowledge or information has a tendency to flow into culture and will really shape culture. And from culture, politics pulls from culture. So sometimes we have a tendency, we want to start on the political side, where really we ought to be starting on the information side, which that's what I think we're talking about here. The good news is information. It is really good information. I don't know of any better information to provide than the good news of Jesus. And where you do that, when you do that, Jesus had, arguably, you could say he had about 5 different contexts in which he spread that good news. He did it in a public context, teaching on the Sermon on the Mount where there was lots of people. He did it with his followers, which was a smaller group. He did it with his apostles, which was even a smaller group. He did it with Peter, James, and John, which was even smaller. And he also looked to the Father for everything in which he did. So I think we could learn from those 5 contexts that that's where we have the opportunity to be like Jesus and to present that good news. Okay? Any last thoughts? And then we'll move over to question number 2, which is coming from chapter 6. Okay? All right, the second one is found in chapter 6, beginning in verse 19. It runs down through verse 34. We've sort of laid these all together as the portion about laying up treasures in heaven and our anxiety around that. So this is a teaching about focusing on the good. You know, Jesus uses the analogy of if your eye's full of light versus eye being full of darkness. And the point here he's trying to get to, this is rooting out covetousness, the focus on within the 10 Commandments, do not covet. And that is coveting. Coveting is a desire to make us want things that we don't have or need. So here are our questions around this second. Where do you put your time and money? And do you agree these are the measures of where our heart is? Do we really believe that God will take care of us? And if so, are we anxious and busy with the temporal things of life or focused on truly eternal things of life? Okay. We'll go about another 10 minutes or so and then come back and have some more conversations. Okay. Let me start with the easy one of these questions. I hope so. Does anybody disagree with number 2? If you do, you're going against what Jesus taught. I'm just curious. So maybe that was the easy one and that was a rhetorical comment or rhetorical question. So hopefully we all agree that this is a measure of where our hearts are focused. All right, so we want to have a conversation around where you find yourself putting time and money, or maybe do you really believe that God will take care of us? That may be a hard one for us to admit that I don't know that we really do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be anxious about things, would we? We wouldn't probably spend our time chasing and really focusing more on temporal things as opposed to eternal things. This is a tough one. Who's willing to be vulnerable here?
Okay, cool. All right, so this was a tougher question than the first, because all of these can be double-edged sword questions. There's a silver lining in everything, and as far as the time and money aspect, I like to try and find strategic ways that I can help people long-term, whether it be in smaller or larger actions. Like, what is going to help this person get good and stay good in whatever facet of their life? Like, and these are not measures, I don't believe, of our heart, of where our heart is, because, well, I mean, how much I give to someone doesn't determine whether I go to heaven or not. But it does, however, speak to my character in the way I'm called to be more Christ-like. Now, as far as anxiety is concerned, well, I feel like, to be anxious is to be human. the easiest way to ease anxiety is to stop and actually look for the good. As humans, it's so much easier to see the negative in absolutely everything. And then when you stop and look where you were 10 years ago, where were you 10 years ago? Okay, now where are you now? When you really look at things like that, it becomes obvious that God is taking care of you. Everyone's story is different, which is why we find strategic ways to help people long term. I think one of the better examples that I've seen, and I'll try to keep this shorter, but when I was working in construction, I had a contractor that refused to hire from staffing services. He'd show up every morning with a truck bed full of homeless people. I'm like, oh, interesting tactic. And he'd give them all a hard hat and a broom, and he'd pay them every day. And he'd offer to allow them to sleep inside the gates every night. So he gave them work, provides purpose, gave them money, the ability to provide sustenance, and a safe place to lay their head every night. That, to me, is more valuable than simply putting a $20 bill in someone's hand on the side of the road. Because it kind of calls to the whole, if you teach a man how to fish, he'll feed himself every day. But if you give him a fish, he's going to eat for that one meal. So I believe God takes care of me, but I'm also human. So even in my days where I look around and I'm very clearly blessed, I still have anxieties. But I do believe God takes care of us all.
Yeah. One thing I heard from that is, okay, here was this man with a business. So we might think, wow, that's capitalism. Really focused on making money. Temporal things, right? No, what was he doing with that? That's really what I think the teaching of Jesus is. We can have as much as we're willing to obtain, but the focus is what we're going to do with it. Are we going to do it to benefit ourselves or somebody else? I think that's the real teaching there, the distinction is what are we going to do with what God has given us as stewards towards eternity? Or is it just we're going to use it for temporal things? So I think that's the distinction. I like that example. Thank you, David. Anybody else real quick? And then we're probably time to move on to our next one, but Barry?
For the Christians in countries where they are poor, they are persecuted, they have little or nothing, being dependent upon God is a lot easier because they don't have nothing of their own to depend on. The opposite is true in our country. We have such an abundance and ease of life. It is far too tempting to depend on ourselves and our own wealth to provide our needs. It's much more difficult for us to focus on God's kingdom and His righteousness and let that lead us and depend on Him to provide for us. And thus, I think it is very, very important for us to realize that the things we have, the abundance that we have, all came about because of His provision. And it can be taken away very quickly. So it's tempting to depend on ourselves, but we must remember to focus on His righteousness, on His kingdom, on being the light of the world, and keep in mind that everything that we have is very temporal. Our lives don't last very long, and nothing that we have lasts very long. So the things in this world are really not that important. It's only the things of the kingdom that we need to focus on.
All right. Let's go to our third and final question. This is taken out of Matthew chapter 7, first 14 verses. It lumps together the judging, the asking from God, and the golden rule of how we want to be treated. So Jesus tells us to judge rightly. In other words, without any prejudice at all, and with generosity. This is the biblical justice, when everyone is treated rightly and with generosity. So when it's done rightly and with generosity, we put our dependence on God, who is the righteous and generous judge. So the questions are, how do you apply this when judging other people? Are we quick and unfair in our judgments that lack truth and grace? And do we treat people the way we want to be treated? And in this teaching, to whom do we depend? God or the government? That's that part of be careful about casting your pearls before swine, giving what's holy to dogs. So where have we gotten this wrong and put too much dependence on things like the government? All right, so those are your questions. We'll be back to you in about 10 minutes and we'll wrap up. Okay. I'm curious if anybody tackled number 4 and spent some time there. Yes? You want to have a conversation around that?
Sure. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. We are to be the salt of the earth, a light on a hilltop. We should be influencing our families, our schools, our local, state, and federal governments to follow Christ the way that we do. God does provide sometimes through the government. That's still God providing. It's not the government. It's still God being over all, ruling all. So I think the framing of the question, I have to question the framing of the question, because it sounds like if you rely on the government, that is not coming from God. And I want us to be real careful about being in this community, in this city, and having that mindset. There are a lot of people who only make it not because they're not hardworking, not because they have not put in a lot of time and effort to bettering themselves, but they only make it in this life because we give to the government through our taxes, and those taxes take care of them. So I think the way that we frame that question needs to have a lot more sensitivity. They're not mutually exclusive. And further, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Anybody else? Either on number 4 or any of the others? Mary Lee?
God has put our government in place. We may not like them. We may not have voted for them, but He put the governing people in place. And there are disabled people that need our help, and giving what we're supposed to the government takes care of them. So.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a difference I think that you were addressing is if you look at this day and time, taxes were still being paid, but there was still an individual responsibility to take care of the needy. So I think if you look at that, those are the responsibilities that God calls us to. Does He call the government to take care of the needy? He said, well, to protect, but how about the provision? I think the thing we have to be, it's that tension there we have to be careful with. is because, let's say, if that's an individual responsibility and collectively we come together as a called out people of God, that we are to take care of the needy, the poor, and the widows, we can't absolve that responsibility to somebody else. Even though there may be things that we are giving to the government that they end up doing it, but we can't, I think the tension is we can't say, well, that's the government's responsibility. God's called us to that individually. And if there's means to be able to do that through other means as well, but let's don't shirk our responsibility first to allow somebody else to do it. Okay? I think that's probably the clarifying point there. Others about maybe the judging? Okay, Dave, real quick, and then we'll close.
So,
Donald, go ahead.
so with number 2, the judging, for me, and we had some discussion here, it's a bit challenging not to when you drive on I-77, I-85, and 485, and you don't know what the person ahead of you is going through or the person that's coming from behind you, 95 miles an hour, where they're going, what circumstance. So, driving with truth and grace can be challenging. But we have to practice it. I have to practice it. So that would be the quick and unfair. And there's other things too, but that's a real deal situation every week, day in and day out, and not uttering empty words as you're driving, because that could be just as bad.
That's right. Drive the way we want others to drive, right? And that's safely and friendly. All right. Let's close up here. But how does your life compare to the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, we know Jesus is challenging us in ways that likely we've never been challenged before when we honestly compare our lives to these teachings. What if we spent our entire lives focused on these things that Jesus is getting us to focus on? If we don't, then what he's telling us, you're living a lie. Live the truth. Focus on the things that I am teaching you to live out. And if you do that, you're living a life that is formed according to the cross, a cross-shaped life, a life that is lived according to these teachings on the Sermon on the Mount. So let's continue as he ends that teaching, to say, choose wisely. Choose. Allison, thank you for your prayer this morning about that foundation, that we choose to have that foundation on the rock. Make it solid. Make our choices be solid and focus on living for Jesus. All right. Don?
I feel you struggling.
That morning commute.
And granted, I travel into Gastonia, and it's not so bad, but the evening can be